Over the years, I've heard many objections to the ontological argument, yet they all seem to fail at proving that maximal greatness is an impossible property. In this video, I'm going to refute the 7 most popular objections to the argument. However, before I get started, I want to be clear. This argument does not assume that existence is a property, which was one of Immanuel Kant's objections. Alvin Plantinga demonstrates this in his version of the argument. Now, if you don't know much about the modal ontological argument, I would recommend stopping here and watching the video I have on it. Now, if you already understand this version of the ontological argument, then you know that I don't need to prove that God exists. All I need to do is defend premise 1 of the ontological argument, because the other 4 follow modal logic and are not disputed. So all I need to show is that it is possible for a maximally great being to exist. With that out of the way, I want to touch on the first objection, which is the Omnipotence Paradox. Now, if you already watched my other video introducing the ontological argument, you know I already talked about this. But I want to take a quick excerpt from that video and put it here just to mention it. It is most commonly presented like this. Can God create a stone so heavy that even he can't move? If God cannot create the stone, then he is not all-powerful. But if God can create the stone and can't move it, then he is still not all-powerful. Therefore, the idea of God is impossible. However, this attempt is debunked in the question itself as a logical absurdity. Asking can an omnipotent being create a stone so heavy even he can't move implies that omnipotence is defined as able to do the logically impossible, which is not consistent with the definition of omnipotence. No one who believes in omnipotent God believes God can do the logically impossible. The Bible has verses that state it's impossible for God to do certain things. Asking the question is like asking, can an omnipotent being create a square with 3 sides? Or can an omnipotent being tell you the shape of purple? Or can an omnipotent being tote an 11? It's just gibberish. All these questions. Because I already covered this, I don't want to spend too much time on it. For a longer explanation, check out my first video. Now, the second argument used to show that God can't exist is the logical problem of evil. David Hume is most famous for presenting it. Here's how it goes. The world is filled with pointless evil. Now, there may be a God that is all good, but not powerful enough to stop it. Or there may be a God that is all-powerful, but not good enough to want to stop it. Therefore, there is no all-powerful, all-loving God. However, within academia, it is generally agreed upon that Plantinga's free will defense has shown that such a God can logically exist. William Alston says, the effort to demonstrate that evil disproves God is now acknowledged on almost all sides in philosophy as completely bankrupt. Here is how Plantinga's free will defense goes.
A world containing creatures who are significantly free and freely perform more good than evil actions is more valuable, all else being equal, than a world containing no free creatures at all. Now, God can create free creatures, but he can't cause or determine them to do only what is right. For if he does so, then they aren't significantly free after all. They do not do what is right freely. To create creatures capable of moral good, therefore, he must create creatures capable of moral evil. And he can give these creatures the freedom to perform evil and at the same time prevent them from doing so. C.S. Lewis would agree, saying, imagine a wooden beam became soft as grass when it was used as a weapon, and the air refused to obey me if I attempted to set up in it the sound waves that carry lies or insults. But such a world would be one in which wrong actions were impossible, and in which, therefore, freedom of the will would be void. If the principle were carried out to its logical conclusion, evil thoughts would be impossible, for the cerebral matter which we use in thinking would refuse its task when we attempted to frame them. Continuing his defense, Plantinga says, as it turned out, sadly enough, some of the free creatures God created went wrong in the exercise of their freedom. This is the source of moral evil. The fact that free creatures sometimes go wrong, however, counts neither against God's omnipotence nor against his goodness, for he could have forestalled the occurrence of moral evil only by removing the possibility of moral good.
As Plantinga teaches, just because God permits evil, that doesn't mean there aren't any good reasons for it. It may very well be less benevolent for God to deny us freedom than to prevent us from committing moral evil. I have attached a link to the full-length video in the information section, as well as an interview with Alvin Plantinga explaining the free will defense. Now, the third attempt to show that God is impossible is with the problem of imperfection, which goes like this. God, a perfect being, would not create an imperfect world, but the world is imperfect. Therefore, a maximally great, perfect God cannot exist. However, this argument is rarely used in academia. What we perceive as an imperfect world might not be imperfect from the perspective of the whole universe. Plus, an atheist recently told me that even if the world were proved imperfect, the best conclusion you could draw is that there is no God both omnipotent and interested in creating a perfect world. Which is similar to the biblical definition that the world was created perfect and became imperfect after sin entered and humans went out from God's perfect protection. Therefore, all things we consider imperfect were once perfect and became imperfect with the absence of God to hold everything to perfection. Now, another attempt to disprove God's existence is to demand empirical evidence. Since there's no empirical evidence for God, then he can't possibly exist. Now, others and myself argue that empirical evidence can't prove the existence of everything. I mean, does a statement something must have empirical verification for it to be true have empirical verification? Besides, God is not defined as a three-dimensional physical being, so he can't be proven or disproven through scientific observation. So God's existence relates to this world in the same way Shakespeare relates to Hamlet, and it is impossible for Hamlet to prove the existence of Shakespeare through empirical observation of his world. Plus, we only need to defend premise 1, which only states that it is possible that God exists. To deny the possibility of God's existence, you would have to be omniscient, or have logical proof of his incoherence. So remember, in order to debunk this argument, you need to show that God's existence is utterly impossible, or it still stands. Now the fifth way is to try to do a reverse ontological argument, starting with premise 1 saying, it is possible that a maximally great being does not exist, then following with the other 4 premises and concluding that a maximally great being does not exist. Which seems logical at first, but the problem is in premise 2, because we need to remember that the idea of a maximally great being has not been shown to be incoherent. Therefore, the idea is coherent and doesn't contain any logical absurdities. Therefore, a maximally great being isn't impossible and can exist in some possible worlds. So if it is possible that a maximally great being doesn't exist in some possible worlds, then he has to be shown to be logically absurd before you finish premise 2. Plus, this argument's conclusion is that maximal greatness is impossible. But the modal perfection argument developed by Robert Modal establishes that maximal greatness is a possible property. Here's the easiest way I found to explain this argument. 1. If a property is a great-making property, its negation is a lesser-making property. Makes sense so far. 2. Great-making properties do not entail lesser-making properties. Makes sense, because how could a great-making property be a great-making property if it required flaws? 3. Maximal greatness is the greatest of all great-making properties. Therefore, maximal greatness cannot entail its negation of non-maximal greatness. Now, number 3 is important, because in modal logic, it is perfectly reasonable for a property that is logically impossible to entail its opposite. Take, for example, square circularity. Since square circularity is an impossible property, then all things must negate square circularity, meaning everything entails non-square circularity. But if everything entails non-square circularity, then we must include all impossible properties as well, which means square circularity entails non-square circularity. So, if we conclude that maximal greatness is an impossible property, then all things must negate maximal greatness. Therefore, all things entail non-maximal greatness, including impossible properties such as maximal greatness. Therefore, maximal greatness entails non-maximal greatness. But looking back at the modal perfection argument, we see that maximal greatness cannot entail its opposite, because great-making properties, such as maximal greatness, cannot be great-making properties and entail flaws from lesser-making properties. That would be logically absurd. Plus, maximal greatness is perfection, and if perfection is logically absurd, then we cannot adequately define things like evil, hate, and ignorance as imperfections. I mean, someone could define ignorance as a great-making property, along with intelligence, which would be incoherent. Therefore, if maximal greatness is a possible property, then in some possible world there is a being with maximal greatness. And then modal logic shows us that a maximally great being exists. So from there, the sixth attempt to debunk the ontological argument is to claim that with the same modal logic that a maximally great physical being could exist, like a maximally great unicorn. But the problem with this is that physical beings require space to exist, and modern cosmology teaches that all matter once existed as a singularity. and no physical being could exist in such a state. Therefore, physical beings cannot be maximally great, because there was a time and a place that existed without physical beings. The last objection I will cover is the claim that there could be other maximally great beings, such as quasi-maximally great beings, that also exist along with God. However, if we conclude that a maximally great being exists, then we also have to conclude that there can only be one maximally great being, because if multiple beings were omnipotent, then their wills would conflict. If one omnipotent being in a possible world creates unicorns, another omnipotent being in the same world could make it impossible for unicorns to exist, and you would be left with a logical absurdity. Therefore, there can only be one omnipotent being, which is the one we call God. But how do we know that the one omnipotent being is all good and not all evil, such as the argument that God is really a cosmic sadist? Well, C.S. Lewis has shown that it is logically impossible for someone to be evil just for the sake of being evil. In reality, we have no experience of someone being evil just to be evil. The closest we can get is cruelty. But in reality, people are only cruel to gain something, such as power, pleasure, or safety. But these are not evil. They are good to have. The evil comes from pursuing them with the wrong motives or in the wrong way. When you examine it, evil is nothing more than the pursuit of something good in the wrong way. However, unlike evil, you can be good just for the sake of being good. You can do a kind act even if it gives you no pleasure, simply because it is the right thing to do. But no one can be cruel just for being cruel, or be cruel without gaining something good. In other words, badness cannot succeed even in being bad in the same way in which goodness is good. Goodness is, so to speak, itself. Badness is only spoiled goodness, and there must be something good first before it can be spoiled. C.S. Lewis points out that the creator of the universe must be morally perfect because evil cannot exist on its own and is always a perversion of good. Therefore, God must be a God of love for him to even exist or create anything. But wait, this presents another problem, because if evil is not at the core of God, then love must be. But how could God be necessarily loving? Because love is an action that is expressed between two people, and God is the only being that existed by himself before he created anyone else. So God cannot be loving in all possible worlds, since there was a time and a place when he couldn't love anyone but himself. Therefore, he cannot be maximally great or a creator. Well, I don't know how other religions can answer this, but in Christianity, we know God revealed himself as a triune God, one being that is three persons coexisting together. Therefore, the Trinitarian God of the Bible can be a God of love, because each member of the Trinity loves and needs one another. Therefore, if God is multi-personal, then it is still possible that he exists. And if it is possible that God exists, then God exists in some possible worlds, and if God exists in some possible worlds, then God exists in all possible worlds, meaning God exists in the actual world, and if God exists in the actual world, then the triune God of Scripture exists.